from outside. We got to this conference today because Jen and Suzanne got money. Where did they get the money from? Well, they got the money from the federal government. Well, how did they get, well, I had to go and write this grant proposal. And it had to go through the university and so on and so on. So there's these lines of action that construct the moment that we experience. And for institutional ethnography, it's interesting to see how the lines of action actually pull together that moment of experience. Because that's what we know is that moment of experience. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, cool, thank you.
So you both talked about policy from really different angles, and one of the things that is not really terribly apparent, but that's been happening for a while, and it's actually a global phenomenon in terms of games, is that it's an industry that governments are massively investing in, and they're giving incredible kickbacks to games companies for basically bringing their business to a province or to a country like France and like this province in Ontario. And normally when they give this kind of massive funding that's both infrastructure but labor related, so for instance in Ontario, you basically 40% of your labor bill is paid by the Ontario government. So you're only paying for 60% of your labor force and the government's paying for the rest. And usually, and this is the case like Quebec everywhere, just about, that has really been trying to seduce or attract games companies. And this constitutes a massive social and cultural investment on the part of governments worldwide, Ireland, Scotland, UK. What is really interesting about it is that usually when you're giving this kind of social and cultural work is that there's some kind of requirement on the part of the government, some kind of policy interference that says, okay, at the very least you have to meet our equity targets. You have to actually meet our affirmative action targets. You can't have a company that's 94% male, for example, and 93.5% white. So what I'm trying to think about, and as you both talked about policy really differently, is it's not that I necessarily am arguing for more governance, but what do we do when we have this massive investment of funding and yet no accountability structure? And how do we talk back to that no accountability? And I know it's a big question, but I just toss it out.
I don't quite know what you mean by accountability.
Normally when you give funds, there's some social and cultural outreach that's either attached to the funds or that's a requirement of the funds, e.g. affirmative action. They do meet affirmative action targets. We have those in our universities, you know. So that's what I mean by that. I mean that you would be paying 40% of a labor force bill, but there's no kind of requirements on that 40%, e.g. that it means that 10% of your funds that you make go back into the community, anything. Nothing like that.
Or the new policy that says that you can hire foreign trained workers for less than you hire local workers if you can't find the local workers. Right? So of course you can't. Well, it's a really interesting, because it depends on where that money comes from. So how does it happen? Does it happen through tax relief? See, there's one of these kinds of questions we have to ask. Where does the money come from? How does it get, because it is accounted for in some ways, but it's not, it's set up so that it goes around. So if they're going to give them tax relief, then how is that structured? It may be that if it's an order in council, for example, you don't have to pay any attention to any of the legislation. I don't know. And one of the problems in, and I think you'll agree with me, is that in this area of research is we study down and we don't study up. So there are a few of us who know how government works and how that money moves around.
I mean, if I'm understanding, there's clearly, you can, there's like multiple points of intervention. So you could, organize people to push back to try to get those kinds of equity things built into the resource allocation, right? I think that would take, coalition work. I mean, there was a great discussion earlier about it's Rich Held My Back, Bernice Johnson Reagan, right? And we're talking about sector consolidation. We're not talking about everybody has to agree. We're talking about building coalitions with some uniting principles. So maybe it's about, we're going to get everybody together and say, no, this money can't be allocated without these 15 or 16 explicit demands. I mean, I think when we think about power, we often think about it really statically, and I think that it's important to see that decision makers like it's an inverted triangle. The people of power, people at the top are a small number of people. So if we can figure out ways to mobilize and organize, the farther we get down the base, the more power we have. So if we can get a coalition of people together, the poverty, great poverty people in Ontario, I'm looking at you because I said the Seneca Falls, you will know the people in Ontario. Anyway, it's okay. I think that coalition work, I think that's one point of intervention. I don't know if you were asking for the point of taking the money, like what the accountability is if you take that money. And I kind of think, I think that money for organizing work is often problematic, but I also get that people have to pay the rent. I feel like that Kenny Rogers song, you got to know when to fold them, you got to know when to build them, you got to know when to walk away, you got to know when to run. I feel like that's my thing with taking money, right?
You like cowboy music?
No, but I just love that song, right? I think it really I think that you end up in these situations where you take money and you're like, what did I just sign up for, right? So I have signed up for something that I am not really prepared to do, so I'm walking away, right? So, or I can hustle the money, I can launder the money through an organization, pay somebody else, it's all good. So I feel like for me, in my political life, that's how I think about wealth redistribution, right? But I also think that it's really, the farther you go up the food chain getting it, the more complex it is to do some of that redistribution. But I think for policy work, I think that we also can't think that policies change systems, right? I think or policies change practices. So our goals can't be just to if we get those policy changes so we can have, the set-asides or whatever, right? That's not necessarily going to mean that systems change. So I think that's for me why it's really important to build these communities of practice, these communities, these coalitions where it's not like everybody has to get along, right? We're going to have 5 or 6 central organizing things that are going to unite us. And we're going to use that coalition, we're going to use that collectivity to really push forward both policy change but also corresponding political education so we can learn about other people's, other stakeholders. Like a lot of people talk today about coming to consciousness around feminism. And I think that if we think about that, and we multiply that with the other kinds of structural oppressions and systems that we have, and if we could hear other people's stories about coming to consciousness about poverty, coming to consciousness about, compulsory heterosexuality, I think that's actually really powerful. So I just want to give that little push for.
And I think it's important too to pay attention to what's going on in the news. They've got this wonderful thing happening in Quebec.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, 500,000 students out on the free tuition is on the